Hello, and welcome to Saving People Queering Things, a supernatural podcast. We were previously known as Driver Picks the Podcast, and the episode you're about to listen to was recorded under that name. Though our name has changed as of season 3, our show hasn't changed that much. Our structure and theme-based discussions are the same, and we're so glad you're here. Now, let's get on the road. Hello, and welcome to Driver Picks the Podcast, the show where we talk about ghosts, road trips, and free will through every episode of the TV series Supernatural. Today, we will be discussing Season 1, Episode 3, Dead in the Water, through the theme of fear. I'm Abigail, your host and former Castiel cosplayer. Joining me today is Renny, the only other host on this podcast who has actually seen the entire show as much as I have, and who is actually the one responsible for getting me back into watching Supernatural during quarantine.
Hi.
So glad to have you. Renny's actually a huge reason why I started this podcast, because we had been having some really fun discussions around season 15 of the show. And I was like, I think this should be something we do on in a more fun format. And thus this was born.
Yeah, we basically have a podcast about Supernatural every time we talk, so we might as well record it.
Yeah, that was basically the thing. Exactly. Our first segment on this show is our series recap, The Road So Far. And so far, we are on episode 3, so there's not a lot that's actually happened yet. We have met Sam and Dean Winchester, the two main characters of this show. We have met their family. We've seen their mother, Mary, died when Sam was a baby and Dean was about 4. And ever since then, they were hunting with their dad, hunting the whatever killed their mom and hunting other monsters as well. We first meet them in their mid-20s when Sam has been off at college for a number of years and Dean has been hunting with his father, and Dean arrives to tell Sam that their father is missing. They hunt together, they return Sam to Stanford, and Sam finds that his girlfriend has also been killed by presumably the same thing that killed their mother. And then Sam and Dean set out on the road to find their father and try out and also hunt down the monster or thing that killed both their mother and Jess. And that's about where we've basically made it to. They've been on one other hunt since they set off on the road together, and that brings us up to speed. So the next thing that we do on this podcast, this is a thing that has been both loved and hated by my other hosts so far. This is our 30-second recap. This is shamelessly stolen from Harry Potter and the Sacred Text. We're very grateful for it. And basically, we're going to get timed 30 seconds to recap the events of this episode. We'll both get a turn, and we'll see what we can include. Really, you can focus on whatever you want, whatever you think is important. That can be the plot, that can be character arcs, that can be fun moments. Really, there's no right or wrong answer. We'll see how far we get with the content of this episode, Dead in the Water, which is actually one of my favorite episodes in season 1, I think. There's a lot of really fantastic episodes in this season, but this one is a really early, really strong episode. Would you like to start, or would you like me to start? Either of those.
You just start.
That's what has been
As
on the
a
other
veteran,
episode.
I feel that you can set the tone for the recap.
Yes. Sounds good.
1, 2, 3, go.
Okay, so Dean finds this case of these people that have been going missing in this lake, and so they arrive at this town and they meet this sheriff, and it's very mysterious. They don't know why people have been disappearing. They've dredged the lake, they can't find anyone. Then they help this mother and son, and the son won't talk because he saw someone lost in the lake. And then they do a bunch of investigation. They find out that someone drowned back years ago, and the ghost's been hunting them ever since, and then they stop it. That was missing a lot. It's in a lot of time once.
You did a good plot overarching plot.
And now you can fill in maybe some of the.
Mine is not a linear plot one.
Oh no, that's good. That's good. I like that, because I think I want to move away from linear plot ones, because I think you tend to actually get everything better. So, are you ready?
Yeah.
On your mark, get set, go.
Okay, so in this episode, a random person that they never discuss, a whole family of 3, and the sheriff all die in a haunted lake. The boys solve the mystery with the help of a cute kid. Dean flirts with a girl. Dean is good with kids many times, bonding over watching a parent die, which is the cutest thing to bond over. There's a motif of losing your kids being worse than dying. They're sad because they didn't save everyone. Classic. Dean makes another college day at Sam. There's another bonding moment between Dean and the kid. And then the car drives out of town. Good.
So now that we've done our 30-second recap, we will jump right into our theme discussion. So our theme this week is the theme of fear. And so, yeah, my question to you is, and I've got some notes as well, is where do we see this theme? And then what is this kind of theme telling us about the show in general, or even on a bigger scale? What are some of the things we can learn from seeing this theme in this episode? I know you have some notes and thoughts, and we talked a little bit about some of them during when we watched it.
Yeah, I mean, you can take it from any angle, right? Like you can take fear in terms of the viewer. You can talk about fear in terms of the brothers and what their motivations are and where fear is part of that. And then there's a ton of interesting discussion about fear with the guest stars in this episode, like the Monster of the Week plot, because fear is driving so much of what all of them are doing. And so, yeah, I have a lot of notes. I don't know if we'll get to all of them, but I did want to start by saying, because I think it's funny, this episode has always scared me a lot because the monster is creepy.
The monster is very creepy.
Yeah, and I'm always afraid of deep water, something like grabbing your ankle. And then the creepy dead kid saying, "Come play with me," is like the scariest thing ever. Like that beats, the vampires and the ghosts and the demons and everything for me. That's way scarier.
It's like very I've forgotten how underplayed that moment is in the actual episode. Like it's just like it's just like kind of offhandedly mentioned, but it's very creepy.
Yeah,
very creepy.
When you see the little head at the end.
Yeah. Yeah. I think I always forget how creepy this episode is. Probably primarily because most of the time, I didn't this time, but most of the time I think I genuinely like skip.
Oh yeah, for sure.
Earlier death scenes, like the bathtub and the sink death scene, particularly.
I do that
because they're both like kind of grotesque.
Yes.
So,
well, in rewatching the show in general, I always skip the death scene before the supernatural.
Yeah, same.
Word comes on the screen, because it's always not very relevant to what the boys are going through, and that's all I care about.
And once you've seen it once, you know what it is. Know, like someone has died, and the mystery will get
that's all you need to
from
know.
there. It's also interesting, like the first couple of seasons are so much more that mystery. Like that's so much more of like how they're played, and even just the whole tone of the show of like this sort of gothic Americana monster mystery is kind of the setup for all these, which is why you get these like one-off episodes that in some ways, we'll talk about this, I'm sure, some of the continuity of like how monsters work in these first few seasons. Like the monsters in these first couple of seasons are genuinely scarier than a lot of the later monsters. Even though the later monsters are much more powerful. Yeah.
It was a horror show. It was pitched as a horror show. And when Kripke was the showrunner, I think you can see that a lot more. And also I think Kim Manners is a director. Like he directed this episode, and a lot of his episodes are really creepy, I find. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's really true.
Yeah.
Definitely that element of fear for the view. They're meant to, it's filmed in a way to make the viewer fearful.
Yeah.
But I think we probably have a lot more notes about.
Oh yeah, more interesting.
Yeah. No. Anyway, go for it. Go for pulling one of the ones that you had.
Well, it's smaller in the episode, so I'll just mention the brothers and like just a little bit of fear that I saw. I think it's interesting that they keep having this repetitive argument, even though it's only the third season. Or the third episode. I know they've already had this argument a few times where Sam wants to be, directly on track to find and kill the monster and find their dad. And Dean is more like, let's be together and hunt and
uncover all the mystery. Like, let's make sure we don't leave no stone unturned.
Yeah, exactly. Be more thorough and detailed. But also I think you can just really see that Dean feels comfortable in the life of hunting, and that's what he wants to spend his time on, and Sam doesn't really care that much about the week to week hunt. He just wants to, kind of check the box, I guess, at this
He wants
point.
to move the plot forward to like
Yeah.
get back to his life.
But they're so angry at each other about it. And I think that anger is rooted in fear. They're both afraid for their dad. Sam's grief as well, I think, is part of that anger. And so Dean channels his fear into hunting, and Sam channels his fear into like revenge. And that is totally like a recurring theme throughout the whole show. So I just thought that was interesting because you can see that in the little fight that they have I think it's in the diner at the beginning of the episode.
Yeah, I noticed that because we had talked about last week about the fight they have in the Wendigo episode about the same thing, about Sam's just like, let's just leave, let's just go find dad. Dad's not here, let's just go. And Dean has to also kind of rein him in and be like, also these people are important, like also this situation is important, also we want to finish this job. But I think that like we talked about belonging last week and about how like Dean belongs in this hunting world and Sam doesn't. He belongs in this very specific hunt to find their dad, but not really in the hunting world at large yet. And that I think also is based in fear, is like he has already lost so much. And
he's afraid to lose his identity, I think.
I think
he's
so.
Worked so hard to separate himself and his identity from his family, and he's afraid of losing that.
Yeah.
And it turns into anger and revenge.
And every time the hunt gets prolonged, every time the hunt is about the hunt and not about finding their dad, he's then forced to kind of reckon with like, who am I in this scenario?
But this is kind of a side note, but I found it interesting that he is so attentive and like soft with strangers that he's helping. And he, even though it's Dean that's forcing him to do these hunts at this point, it's Sam who's like, really sweet, and he's the approachable one, and he's the one that, the people who are grieving want to talk to more. And it's so interesting to me that he puts on that front for these strangers, even though he doesn't really want to be there.
Yeah,
and then
he only shows that with Dean.
With Dean, he's like this angry kid still.
Which is interesting when you think about their sort of like roles, which I wonder also might tie well a little bit indirectly to a thing that we both pointed out when we were watching, which was that like Sam has this incredulity around Dean's interaction with the kid. Like at the beginning, he's like, Dean has the moment with the kid when he meets the kid, and then he tries to hit on Andrea, the mom, and it doesn't go well. She like reads him 100% for what he's doing and is like, yeah, that's not going to work. And then Sam laughs at him and is like, how many kids do you even know? And that comes up over and over again, where Sam's a little bit like incredulous that Dean is so good with this kid, which I had to laugh at because like, who raised you, Sam? Like literally as a child. Dean raised you.
He's the first person who should know how good Dean is with kids.
Yeah, but I also wonder too about that, because what made me think of that in this scenario was the sort of like roles they find themselves in. Like I think Dean is, because he's very comfortable in the hunting world, he doesn't have to kind of refigure out his role there, but they are refiguring out their roles with each other because they haven't been together for so long. And so Sam falls into this like, Sam sometimes falls into this kind of like surly, grumpy, teenager-y sort of like, I don't really know why I'm here. And like, why do we have to do all these things? Like, why do we have to do, which is really interesting and is coming out of also like, I think his projecting, his not knowing what to do in this world, and also his like fear of losing his own identity. So like, he's got this resistance built up towards anything hunting related that you kind of feels like probably was the case when they were in those last few years before Sam went off to Stanford.
But I also noticed that, he's kind of fake with everybody else, right? Like he's not acting the way that he's feeling. But with Dean, even though they've spent so many years apart at this point, and they're such different people, and he's tried so hard to create this different identity, he feels at home and comfortable with Dean. Like it's built into him inherently because Dean raised him. So he is able to be that angry kid with him. He has room to do that. He's safe to do that. He's not afraid to be himself with Dean.
He lets down that guard. And
Yeah,
also,
exactly.
and he also like pays attention, like as much as he seems a little oblivious to like Dean's actual hunting skill set, he also like is paying a lot of attention to Dean in
Mm-hmm.
terms of like the questions Dean's asking of people, and like he listens to Dean's expertise. And he also is paying attention to like when Dean has the conversation with Lucas, and Dean tells Lucas about Mary and about how he felt when he lost his mom, and about how he learned to be brave, and and then Sam brings it up later when they're sitting in the car and asks him about it, and just like, reflects on the fact that they've never talked about it. Like he's paying attention to,
Mm-hmm.
because Dean is his, like they are safe with each other and they both know that. And even the
And
fact
he
that
looks
like,
up to him, I think. I think he still
mhm,
looks up to him, even though he doesn't want to do what he's doing.
yeah. And even like Dean also Dean also trusts Sam and feels at home with him, because he's
Mhm.
like he would never. And this is also, I think, going to be something we're going to continue to see, where like sometimes Dean will say things to someone else, that like often to like someone they're helping on a hunt,
Mm-hmm.
where he's able to be more emotionally honest about his experiences and his traumas than he is directly with Sam. Like he wouldn't have had this conversation with Sam because of a lot of different reasons. But he has this conversation with this kid, but he knows Sam's hearing it. Like he knows Sam's there.
Interesting. Yeah, he's triangulating.
Yeah, yeah, very much so. Like, like I think he's glad that Sam knows that about him, because I think Dean also wants Sam to know the reason that he's so committed to the hunt is not just revenge based like it was for John. Because I think
Yeah.
that's a lot of why Sam left, was because
Yep.
Sam was like tired of being part of John's revenge mission. And Dean's like, that's not why I'm after. Like, even
But
when he's
ironically, that is why Sam's doing it.
yeah,
It's
yeah,
for revenge.
yeah, yes, because I think for both John and Sam, their desire to hunt at the beginning, and particularly
Yeah.
for Sam, is based in fear and revenge.
Yes.
For Dean, it's not. It's based more on,
No.
I think, family ties and
I think
wanting
like
to
sense of
save other
duty.
people from his, and wanting to like protect other people
Yeah.
from having that same
From
fate.
the trauma that he experienced.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Which
I
he
think
even
he
like
has
says
an
straight up.
immense. Sorry, go ahead.
No, I even think he even like he demonstrates and kind of says that straight up in this episode and in the Wendigo episode.
Yeah, totally. And he oh, I forgot what I was gonna say.
Sorry.
No, it's fine. Oh, yeah, I think Dean has this really heavy sense of responsibility that also you know, tracks throughout the whole series. And you can see it in this episode. He's really tied to Lucas and the kid. And he's
Instantly.
really, because he knows the trauma this kid has been through. And that kind of takes me to my next note actually about fear, is that I think it's so interesting that Dean and Lucas, which is kind of the heart of this episode, the thing they bond over is their trauma, that they both
Yep.
saw a parent die as a kid. And that is, it kind of makes me think of fear through the lens of like connection. They have that fear and that pain in common. And Lucas is so afraid of it happening again, happening to his mom or happening to him, that he can't speak. And that's real visceral fear and a very normal trauma response for a kid. And Dean immediately recognizes that. And well, actually not immediately. The second time that he sees Lucas, he says,
as soon as Lucas as soon as he knows that Lucas, that's why, like as soon as Andrea has said, is it Andrea that tells? No, as soon as they've looked it up, and as soon as they find that, as soon as they find it online, that's when he says, I wrote it, and he wrote, no wonder the kid was so freaked out, like watching a parent die. He like says those words, and then the next time they see the kid, he instantly is like, doesn't like, previously he only pays attention really to Andrea. He says hi to the kid, and then he pays attention to Andrea. As soon as he knows it's about the kid, he like switches gears and is like, oh, that's the person that we really, really need to protect.
Yeah, and that can help too. Mm-hmm. Like he knows Lucas knows something. Anyway, yeah, I think that shared fear is really interesting as like kind of the core of the episode. And then, you know, the thing that frees Lucas from that fear is that the truth comes out.
Mm-hmm. And the truth comes out because he's able to know that he'll be believed. Because like one of the things I wrote down too was that Dean says, like, I want you to know that I will like I'm gonna believe you. Like that whatever you saw, like I'm gonna listen to you. Like he believes. He doesn't ever try and say to Lucas that there isn't anything to be afraid of, or that his fear isn't important, or that his fear isn't real. Like he's like, no, you're scared. You saw a parent die. Of course you're scared. Like if you tell me what's happening, I can help. I'll believe you.
Yeah, he knows that it's common with what they deal with, the supernatural creatures, that people are afraid that they won't be believed, which is another form of fear. Is that fear of like social mocking, I guess. And so Dean's protecting him from that too.
Yeah, and that's another thing that connects them. Of like, that's the other thing that actually fits into the heart of this episode, which becomes their bond, because their bond is the only reason they're able to solve this case. It's the only reason.
Yeah.
Like otherwise, realistically, if they don't have this,
back into town and they save Andrea.
The question I had that is not specifically related to fear, but is related to a little bit of a continuity thing of, so they have Sam and Dean have the conversation right after they get the first picture. They have the conversation about like, how does Lucas know what's happening? Like some people after a traumatic event have psychic abilities, and they never actually go back to how Lucas actually knows. So I'm wondering if you have a
theory,
if you have any theories on is Lucas a little bit psychic and we just don't really get follow-up on it?
Well, Lucas was on the floating dock for 2 hours before he was rescued after his dad died. So and then at the end you see the kid when he pulls the sheriff down into the lake. So I think Lucas saw him. So I think that Lucas knows who it is. Whether he recognized it from his grandpa's yearbook photos, recognized the kid from there and like put it together. I don't know. He's not too young to be able to do that.
No. Then how does he? That doesn't really fully explain how he knows where the bike is.
Yeah, that stuff. I think. Yeah, I guess we assume that he's a little psychic, and I think the fact that he's not speaking maybe ties into that. Actually, is you know. I don't know, maybe it's implied that because he's not focusing on communicating, he's able to kind of tap into
I like that.
In the air. I don't know.
Yeah, I kind of like that. Like he's able to sort of see beyond the natural into sort of the supernatural explanation, because which is almost because of his trauma response, because he's so locked in to that fear experience, to that like trauma. He's not able to he's not fully grieving it, because he's just like locked reliving it. He can't get past that, but because he can't get past that, he's then maybe able to access what's going on in a way that like no one else can, even though there are other people in this story who could presumably have, and at least one other character who does figure it out. So like that's actually another note I had in terms of fear, was like when the father of the two early victims, Bill Carlton, when he is on the dock after his son has also died, and he's kind of muttering about, basically indicating that he knows, like that he's like, he knows that something is after him. And we know that he would know what. He's figured that. He's put all the pieces together, whether or not he's entirely figured out what kind of monster it is. Like he's put all those pieces together, and he doesn't actually show a strong indicator of fear. And I found that really interesting. Like the connection of like fear is often connected to things that are like unknown or like not fully known, but he like presumably there's some fear, but he's not really showing it. Like mostly the emotion that we're getting from him is like grief for his kids, grief for his own choices, grief for like the inevitable fact that he's going to die. But then he like drives his boat right out, like knowing what's going to happen. And I wonder if the reason he's not afraid is because he knows, because that unknown factor has been taken out, and he's also hopeless. Like he doesn't have anything. The fear has already like taken away everything meaningful to him. Whereas for Lucas is still so afraid because he still has everything to lose.
Totally. I wrote about that too, and I just wrote grief overrides fear ?
Oh yeah.
Yeah. I wonder if it's his loss that makes him not afraid of sacrificing himself.
Yeah.
He knows it'll appease the ghost.
Yeah.
And so I think maybe he's trying to be noble, and sacrifice himself to protect other people.
Which is the same with the grandfather Lucas's grandfather at the end, where he does seem afraid, but his protective, his like almost his grief and his acknowledgement of his guilt has kind of overridden the fear.
Yeah. And you're right, his protection instincts as well. I think, he would rather that he die than his daughter.
Yeah. And he doesn't make that connection until he doesn't actually make that switch to really seeming to take it seriously until it's actively like there's active danger. Like his fear is mostly centered on like what's going to happen to me, and again on his own guilt up until the point. Well, yeah, and I actually also had a question with about the sheriff. So when once he figures out Sam and Dean are not wildlife service, and he is like, you got two choices, I arrest you or you leave, and I found it really interesting that he plays up this anger at them, this frustration at them, but asks them so few questions about why they're really there. Like he doesn't like, and I wondered if that was also related to fear, is that he is afraid that if he asks any questions, that he'll find out that they know more like about the truth. And then maybe he's already suspicious. Maybe he's already feeling guilty, whether or not he's made the connection between like Peter, between the kid that he killed and this ghost. He still knows that like there should be, or there was 30 years ago, a body in the lake because of his actions. And I wonder if he's afraid of that coming out. And that's why he, like, I couldn't figure out any other reasons that he would not ask them any follow-up questions. Like he would just be like, leave. I don't want to hear anything more. I just want you to leave. Like, I don't want to know why you're really here.
Well, in that anger that he has, it's a little bit kind of an echo of the anger that comes later when he pulls the gun on the boys because he's afraid of the truth coming out. And they're literally telling him what happened, and he's denying it, and he's saying, he's calling them insane liars, and
even with Andrew right there,
tell the truth. Yeah.
Even once he's admitted what he did, he's still not willing to admit that there's a possible consequence in terms of this monster.
Yeah, and that fear of his own like reputation, I guess, probably especially as the sheriff of the town, to be fair.
I wonder if it's also about the consequences too. Like I wonder if it's probably somewhat about reputation, but I wonder if it's also about if he admits that that his actions have like created this monster, then he's not only responsible for this one death, and he's not only going to lose his reputation, but he's also responsible for like all of the deaths that have come afterwards.
Oh, good point. Yeah.
And that's like a horrific weight of consequences.
Yeah. Totally.
And he's afraid of being responsible for all of that, like, which is fair.
Yeah. And he says we were so scared when he's talking about why they kept it a secret as kids. Their fear of the truth kept them in this like prison of secrecy for 40 years or whatever it was.
And you can see his grief when he admits that it was because they were afraid, because he recognizes now that like they were afraid and the kid that they killed was afraid, and that fear has really created this whole thing has happened because they made they made like violent choices, and then every choice they made after that was based in fear.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Question for you.
Mm.
We talked about when we weren't recording, we were talking about how we really both like Andrea as a guest star. I really like her as a character in this episode. I think she's really, I don't know, she just adds a lot to it.
Mm-hmm.
And as you were talking about how Bill Carlton didn't seem afraid, it also struck me Andrea didn't really seem afraid. She had lost her husband, who, by the way, I realized I forgot in my recap. He was also somebody that died. She lost her husband. Her kid's not speaking from the trauma. You know, she knows that there's still, like, they haven't figured out what's happening and there's people that are still dying. She's not afraid. You know, she's only afraid when her life's threatened in the bathtub. But other than that, she's really chill the whole episode.
Yeah.
And I wonder why. I wonder if her protective parent instincts are stronger than her fear.
I think it's that. I think it's also that like she doesn't like connecting to like fear is often when there's something unknown. And yes, there's been a lot of unexplained deaths, but in some ways, if you don't believe in the supernatural, all of those are kind of explainable. Like the girl swimming, like her husband, like fluke drowning, and Lucas hasn't talked since. That kind of makes sense. The girl that drowned like was out swimming, and again, doesn't make sense that she would have drowned, but like accidents happen. The
kid in the sink
doesn't make sense, but also wouldn't seem connected in any way. Except that it happened at similar time. And then the father like driving his boat out and it flipping and him dying, like a guy that's like just lost his whole family, is, you know, maybe seems like more of a like he responded out of grief, and it's a little bit almost like he was not wanting to survive it. And so I think almost I wonder if like part of the reason she's so chill is because she's just trying to like find a way to move on with their lives. Like she's just trying to like care for her kid until eventually he hopefully speaks again. And she's almost trying to like protect against anything else happening by not like she doesn't want to be involved in knowing what's happening until it seems like there's a connection to her family that actually puts them actively in danger. But until they're actively in danger, I think she just wants to like be able to help her son recover from the trauma.
Yeah, like, good point. I agree.
But yeah, I really, really love her as a character. Like,
I think part of it is like part of why we love her is probably that, you know, she's very centered and kind of grounded in the episode, and she kind of is the glue.
And she doesn't we'll have lots of other episodes where we'll talk about like people making really bad decisions when they're in danger to like not protect people that are younger and or more vulnerable, and she like makes all the right decisions based on the information she has. When she doesn't know about the supernatural, she still makes sure that like Lucas is not around for conversations that could be traumatizing to him. She makes sure that when there is any potential danger that he's out of the way. She like doesn't, even the fact that she doesn't immediately let Sam and Dean talk to Lucas is like a good parent instinct. Like she doesn't just let these like strange, even if they are from the authorities, she doesn't immediately, she's like, I don't want to traumatize him again. Like she's a very good mom.
And then at the end, you know, her mom instinct when Lucas is in the lake is to jump in and get him, and Sam tells her, no, you're gonna die too, you need to stay on the dock, and she does.
She trusts them.
She trusts him, but also she knows that it's in Lucas's best interest that she's alive for him. You know?
That she gives him the best possible chance, that she knows there are already two stronger swimmers in the lake, presumably. And she and like when she knows, she acts based on the information she has in the smartest possible ways. And but all in the interest of her son. And that's a very beautiful response to fear. Like even when she's afraid, her response is like measured and centered. Another thing that I was thinking, sorry.
No, go ahead.
One thing I was thinking earlier that I also thought about when it came to the connection between Dean and Lucas is we're only in episode 3. And so we're only 2 episodes away from the pilot, and the whether or not this is an intentional choice to try and mirror a little bit, but like the Lucas is a kid that looks a lot like the actor that they have who plays young Dean in the pilot, who plays like 4-year-old Dean in the pilot. They have
Oh
very
my
similar
God, that's such a
features.
good
They're
point.
both like kind of dirty blonde, long hair. Lucas is like a few years older. Lucas is probably more like 7 or 8.
Yeah.
But they're very similar in features. And I've always wondered if that was, an intentional casting choice, because they're really trying to remind us of like, because there's so much, I mean, honestly, like in terms of like what's happening in the story, Lucas's story and Dean's story are like coincidentally similar. But in terms of like the writer's design of this season, so much everything of like why Lucas exists in this season is so that we get this ability, like opportunity to get to know Dean on a more deeper level, and get to know who he is and what his experiences have been. And Lucas shows us that as he kind of mirrors Dean and allows Dean to kind of even remember what he was like. And I've always kind of wondered how much of that was intentional.
That's cool. I also think Lucas shows us that because it's the first time we see Dean and how well he interacts with kids and how much he really wants to protect them and this instinct that he has. And that, again, that comes up throughout the series. And it's something that, as fans, we all love about him.
Yeah. Yeah.
And it really shows, I think, just so much of who he is as a person, that like, no matter what mission he's on at the moment, he will always stop and take care of the kid in the vicinity.
Yeah.
Or even just the younger person, like later it's teenagers too, that he's older than them. And he just, I think that instinct of protecting Sam that was so drilled into him when he was a kid growing up, it just never leaves. And it's
and
cool.
Sam developed it too. And Sam kind of develops it too, I think, watching him
later,
because we'll also have some really great episodes where Sam is also kind of intentionally takes the most vulnerable person or the youngest person in a scenario and will like walk them through, this is what's going on, this is what's going to happen, this is how we're going to protect you.
But I would credit Dean with teaching him.
For sure. Teaching him
modeling that at the beginning.
no, because he's right now he's very focused on
he is the kid. He still is the kid, I think, at the beginning of the show.
Oh, very much so. Well, very much so. Well, I also think that like it's interesting when you're thinking about fear and Dean with his instincts with kids particularly, and Lucas in particular, of like when they almost leave, when the sheriff tells them, when the sheriff tells them like leave or I'll arrest you, they almost leave. And Sam actually doesn't seem to like, Sam's like not so recent hunting instincts are that like job seems to be done, and also I don't want to stay, so I'm looking for reasons for the job to be done. And Dean's instinct is to follow, and like it's specifically the reason he has that instinct is because of Lucas's fear, because he even says like the kid was still like, I don't feel like this job is done because Lucas is still afraid. Like he follows the instinct of a child's fear and goes, we can't leave because I don't feel like everyone is safe yet.
And at the end, he's sad that they didn't save everyone because so many people died, but that is the reason that they did save Andrea and Lucas. And those two people wouldn't be alive if they hadn't gone back, based on that fear and that instinct that Dean had. The only other kind of fear reading that I had was that the ghost is afraid, and that's why he's attacking, because his lake is draining.
I hadn't even thought of that.
Yeah, it just struck me when they were talking about how the lake was draining. I was like, oh, the ghost is losing his power and his home, I guess. And he, he's a ghost, so he's screwed up, but he's also just a little kid still. And so kind of perpetually a little kid.
Yeah, and stuck in the trauma. Like he's stuck in the lake. He's stuck in the fear and in the lake that he drowned in.
Exactly.
And this lake is disappearing, like his only existence is disappearing.
Exactly. And so that is why all the attacks are happening. It's the fear that's driving it. And I think, it would be interesting to look for all the times that the monster is the monster of the episode because of fear. Because it's probably pretty frequent.
I think I think that's something we should definitely pay attention to, because I think we're going to see that a lot.
I do too.
In some of the more interesting monsters. I think the best monsters are like, well, I think most of the best monsters are ones that have like a motivation, even if the decisions that they make that make them monsters are harmful. The reasons are often starting with fear, especially when it comes to, I think when it comes to a lot of like ghosts and spirits that we'll meet, because they do start as humans. And I think there's a conversation, this isn't really a future season spoiler, but there's a conversation. Yeah, oh, they have a number of conversations. There's a conversation in 15 with a character who I won't name because it would be a spoiler, where like they talk about how like if a spirit isn't put to rest, like if a spirit is stuck on earth and stuck like the spirit is in the water, that they often do eventually become vengeful, just because they're stuck in that loop of like reliving their own death, reliving their own, and they're not, they're in between, they're not at rest, they're not in heaven or hell, they're just stuck
in fear
stuck in fear forever. And that's often what turns ghosts into like vengeful spirits who actually then become violent. Which is probably the last thing I wanted to say about fear, was basically just that question of like, in this episode we see like, what does fear make you? Like, fear always invites some kind of response when it comes to your character and your actions. And we see kind of the full range. We see characters who become angry and vengeful. We see characters who become really, really stuck and like mobile. And we see characters who become like protective and like better and courageous. And Dean even very directly draws that line of like, I was afraid, and bravery is the choice that, like, that made me, I chose to be brave. I thought that was interesting. I think we're going to see that a lot in the show. I think we're going to see that a lot in the show, of like what people's response to fear is.
Yeah, totally. And how the boys, how their response to fear kind of ebbs and flows as the show goes on, and which fears push them to anger and revenge, and which fears push them to bravery. Because I think, like, for Dean, if somebody innocent is threatened, I think that fear pushes him to protection and bravery, like we see in this episode. But if he loses a family member, the fear of that loss pushes him to anger and revenge and makes him insane.
Yeah, and we're gonna see that.
And Sam kind of, the fear of losing his identity and his and his normalcy pushes him to anger and revenge.
Right. He doesn't, they kind of flipped a little.
They're kind of flipped, although I mean, Sam gets really vengeful when Dean is in danger. I won't spoil anything.
I think probably most people who are listening to this are gonna know.
They would know the show, but he does do that sometimes, but not always. Dean is really consistent with that. Sam isn't. It's sometimes he's vengeful when Dean's not okay. Sometimes he's not. Sometimes he's really protective and brave, and he does the right thing. Yeah.
It's an interesting thread to follow. I think this is probably a theme that we'll use again. It would be an interesting theme to use again in a future episode. Totally. We've got a bit, and to be able to build on some of these questions that the show is asking, because the show is asking these questions, I think.
Oh yeah, for sure.
And I like that.
Cool.
Is there anything else you wanted to say in relation to the theme?
No, that was all.
Cool. Yeah, I think that's we talked all my notes too. Cool. That'll be the end of our theme discussion segment.
All right, counters.
Yes. So this next segment that we do is one that's currently we're calling just our counters segment. If we come up with a better name, we hopefully will at some point. That one's not super catchy. And basically, this is where we're keeping track of different elements of the show that we find either insightful or just entertaining. So what I'll do for this is I will kind of explain what the counter is, and if you want to update us on what we're adding to it from this episode.
Sure, sounds great.
Okay, so our first counter is the major character death counter. So just tracking any important characters. And by that, we're defining them as characters who are significant to the story, regardless of how much they've appeared. So we are currently at 2 for this counter, and that 2 is Mary and Jess, even though we've only seen them very, very briefly, but they're significant to the story.
Yeah, and I would say that this episode doesn't have any of those.
We're not going to see any of these one-off characters again.
No.
Unfortunately, because they're wonderful.
Yeah, it would be cool if we saw Lucas when he was older, but
especially if he does have, like psychic power. It would be really cool if
it totally
that, but maybe that kind of answers that question, and maybe he was only kind of vaguely psychic for this one scenario. Our second test is the Bechdel test. And for those of you who are not aware, the Bechdel test is a very low bar way of talking about how a piece of media presents and is in terms of its female characters and its representation. And it's an incredibly low bar. So to pass the Bechdel test, a piece of media needs to have 2 named female characters who talk to each other about something that is not a man. Currently, our Bechdel test is at 0 from the first 2 episodes.
That continues in this one for sure. There are 3 female characters. One of them is a hot waitress, and one of them dies after about 30 seconds, and the other one only talks to men. So
we're not doing so well. We didn't think we thought this was gonna take a while. It's a little depressing. But
I mean, there's 2 males as the lead of the show, and they were supposed to be kind of the only cast. So
yeah,
it makes sense.
And to be fair, like in both the pilot and Wendigo and this episode, the entire cast in any of these episodes is very small. Even the main plot characters. I mean, it's definitely still lopsided. Like we're getting like 2/3 male.
Yeah.
Like if you take out Sam and Dean from the equation, you're getting 2/3 male to 1/3 female. But in most of these episodes, maybe 3/4. But there's not generally been more than like 4 kind of one-off characters in any of these episodes really so far.
And usually one of them's a girl.
Yeah, usually one of them's a girl. Yeah. So yeah, about 1/4. Not great. Okay, our third counter is actually a locations counter. So I grew up in the Pacific Northwest in the Vancouver area where much of Supernatural was filmed. And so quite often in watching, I will notice locations that I've been to or that are familiar to me. And since one of the other hosts on this show is my sister, who also grew up in that same area, we both have some locations we've been to. So we're going to be fun to keep track of that. Our other hosts are not from the area. Yeah, so we're just kind of keeping track of locations we've either been to or really recognize. Right now we have a counter of 1 for that. I'm actually going to add 2 more to that counter today. So the church that they go to is a church in Ladner. I have driven by it before. I've not been inside, but I've driven by it. It's familiar to me. But the location that I'm very familiar with from this episode is actually the lake. So this is a lake called Bunsen Lake. It's in the area that I grew up in. I actually have did an engagement shoot for some friends of mine at this lake. So out on the dock where you get some of the really melancholy scenes of them looking out over the water where this monster is. I've taken some sparklers and waved them around and took pictures of my friends. So it's very different sort of mood, but kind of fun. And it's a beautiful lake. Like this episode really highlights its kind of moodiness, and it's very like mistiness, and it is as pretty as it looks in the show.
Cool. Okay, so in this episode, Abigail and I decided that we're going to introduce a new counter, which is the pop culture and references that are the fake names that Sam and Dean always use when they're talking to law enforcement or whatever authority figure is relevant in the episode, and they're pretending to be other authority figures. And so, yeah, they always use like rock band names or actor names, or they make references to pop culture. So in the first episode is Mulder and Scully, correct?
Yes, it is.
That they use. And then I think you were going to look back on Wendigo because we don't know what it was off the top of our
Yeah,
heads.
I haven't looked in when I need to check and see, so we'll give an update on that one.
And then in this one, what is it?
It's Ford and Hamill.
Oh,
which is really cute. That's
cute.
Harrison Ford and Mark Hamill.
Yeah.
That's a Star Wars reference. Again, very topical.
And probably was Sam's choice, not Dean's.
Yeah. Well, depends when they made these IDs too, because if these IDs are
that's a good point.
they're either new IDs that they've like just made, or they're old IDs from when Sam was like 18.
I was just going to say that reference in the pilot kicks off the self-awareness of Supernatural, which continues to be a really fun theme in the show.
Which I think we'll probably end up talking about some of those references when we get to the little pop culture segment. So our last segment is our kind of predictions and hopes segment. Obviously, Renny and I have both seen the show backwards and forwards several times, so we know what's coming, but we kind of wanted to talk a little bit about what we're excited for going forward, as we know, based on kind of some of the discussion that we've had. What are we excited from what we know is coming? What are we hoping to explore more?
I think like you probably agree with me that the best part of this episode is Dean and Lucas. And, as I will just say now, since I'm going to be in a few of these and it's going to need to be established, I really love Dean.
I think the fact that we talked about him mostly in this episode may have given both
he's
of us away.
He's a little more prominent in this episode too.
Yeah.
It is obvious through what I pick up on and care about. I just think he's a really well played by Jensen Ackles and well written and well developed character with a lot of layers and nuance, and I just think it's really interesting. And you can say the same about Sam. I think he's a really great character too. I have nothing against him. I just feel kind of connected with the character of Dean, I guess. I relate to him in a lot of ways, which I'm sure we'll get into much later in the series.
Yeah.
Anyway, so in this episode, that's the thing that I really like about it the most is his empathy and intuition, and his ability to kind of to use his own trauma, which usually he's very avoidant of, to connect with this kid, and he's willing to go back into that pain. And as you pointed out when we were watching it, the moment when he's talking about when his mom died when he was 4, Jensen played that really beautifully. Even though he was a young actor, he really tapped into like the pain of that moment in his life, and how hard it is for him to talk about it, but he was willing to talk about it with Lucas. And so I think just that part of his character I'm really looking forward to exploring in this podcast, because it comes up a lot. And like we were saying earlier, it's the thing that, he raised Sam. He was his guardian and like parental figure, mom, dad, and brother. And he has that sense of responsibility for everyone else, and I relate to that. So it'll be fun to explore in the future.
Yes. Yeah. That actually leads into like one of the things I'm excited for, which like you mentioned, like Dean is often quite like reluctant to talk about his feelings or talk about his past. But I think one of the things I'm excited is that even in these first 3 episodes, we've seen a lot more openness than I sometimes think about when I think about his character. And I'm excited to explore that kind of character arc for him, of how openness and honesty and like vulnerability ebbs and flows in his character, and how that sort of tracks with like his growth in his relationships, particularly obviously in his relationship with Sam, but also with some other key characters that we're going to see later, of how he builds those trusting relationships and those emotionally vulnerable relationships. Because I think there's a lot of really cool stuff there, and that's a lot of stuff that I've also found really personally meaningful in his character arc. And I'm excited to like be paying attention to it kind of linearly, and to be paying attention to it as it's developing, not just looking at the series as a whole, but looking at it from the beginning, because I've been really excited to see that. I'm also really excited to see sort of Sam, like to pay attention to Sam's character arc as he grows specifically growing into his role as a leader in the hunting world,
Oh
which is
yeah.
be a arc that's going to go the whole 15 seasons. But we see now some of the tensions of like Sam really doesn't want to be a part of this world, and we're going to see that sort of change for him and the push and pull of that. And I'm excited to see that piece of, like, there's lots of really cool stuff about Sam's character that we'll get to, but I'm excited to see that piece specifically play out.
Yeah, Sam's identity journey is really cool. And it's a very prominent thing in these first few episodes, is him and his wrestling with his identity and, you know, wanting to live a quote normal life. And so that's a really cool theme that I'm excited to explore, is Sam's identity journey. And then also I think, like what we were talking about fear, like I think tracking fear through the show is going to be interesting, kind of on a broader scale, obviously not episodically, but yeah, the fear that what role fear plays in the villains, what role it plays with the boys and their dynamic with each other and with the people around them. I think that is a really interesting, important and major theme of the show.
Yeah. Themes of fear and family and free will are all like three themes that we're going to track a ton.
Yes.
And I think that will be a theme that we'll hopefully use as a big picture one, but also come back to this theme of fear episodically every so often and see what more we get from it.
Yeah, that would be cool.
Yeah.
And yeah, I don't know. I really like this episode. I think
Me too.
It's a really good establishing episode for both boys, the dynamic they have with each other, and, you know, it kind of sets the tone for a lot of the themes and questions that they explore throughout the show. It's really good.
It sets the tone for, I think, this is a really good example of what the best Monster of the Week episodes will do. Like this one does not, this episode does not drive the overarching plot forward in any way, but it does drive the character arcs forward. And I think the strongest one-off episodes in the show are going to do that. And this is this is probably the first really good example of that. Yeah. So thank you so much for joining me, Renny.
Yeah, I just wanted to thank you for having me. I'm really excited about this podcast that you're doing and excited to be part of it. And yeah, we love Supernatural and all the deep things that it brings up in us. So it'll be fun to explore it in this context. So thanks for having me.
Yeah, thanks so much for joining me and for inspiring this whole thing. So it's been so fun to have you and can't wait for next time.
Thanks for being my Supernatural buddy and making me feel less weird about my obsession.
We have both indulged each other's obsession over the pandemic, and it is fun to now turn that into a creative project. So thank you everyone, to anyone who is listening, and hope you are also enjoying exploration of the show. And we will talk to you next time. A note to our listeners. This episode was recorded prior to our season 3 name change, where we went from Driver Picks the Podcast to Saving People, Queering Things. For all of our new social media platforms, visit queeringthingspodcast.com.